What's a tariff? Well, let's make it fun. Imagine Catville, a land where cats are obsessed with fish. They love fish very much, but here's the tragedy. They're terrible at fishing. Next door is Dogeland. Rivers sparkle with fish, but hardly any cats live there to eat them. So Catville says, perfect, we'll just buy fish from Dogeland. That's importing. And Dogeland says, great, more customers. That's exporting. So far, everyone's purring with joy. Trade is smooth, stomachs are full, but then Catville's government steps in and makes an announcement.
From now on, every fish that comes in must pay a special toll, a tariff.
Now, the same fish isn't just Dogeland priced, it's government priced. And that small change can shift the whole picture. Because tariffs aren't only about collecting money. They can protect local fishers, influence trade relations, or help support the national budget. But they can also raise prices, limit choices, and sometimes even spark disagreements between neighbors. So the big question is, why do governments keep playing this complicated game? And who ends up paying the real price? Dogeland, Catville, or the poor fish that ends up on the dinner plate? Today, we'll uncover the hidden power of tariffs and how they quietly shape our wallets, our economies, and even our global friendships. So here's the first big question. Where did tariffs actually come from? If we go back thousands of years, kingdoms and empires quickly noticed something. When traders carried goods across their borders, whether it was silk from the East, grain in ancient Athens, or simple handcrafted tools, there was an opportunity. By charging a fee at the border, rulers could both raise money and regulate the flow of goods. That fee was the earliest form of a tariff. In other words, a tax on imported goods. You can think of it as a toll on the road to wealth. For example, in Athens around the 4th century BCE, there was a 2% charge on goods coming in or out, especially on staples like grain. That was essentially an import tax when goods entered and an export tax when they left. The money didn't just vanish into the king's pocket. It was used to fund city defenses and public projects. The Romans went even further. Their tariffs, called portorium, ranged from 2.5% to 5% on goods crossing provincial borders. This revenue kept roads, aqueducts, and even the military running. But there was a downside. When Rome set high tariffs on luxury imports, it pushed up prices and encouraged smuggling, problems that echo what we now call inflation and the rise of black markets. But tariffs weren't only about money. They also acted as protection. Local merchants and craftsmen, who often struggled to compete with exotic or cheaper products, were shielded by these fees. In a sense, it was an early form of what we now call protectionism, supporting local business against foreign rivals. Kind of like Catville's government, making sure some fish stayed for their own cats. Centuries later, during the Industrial Revolution, tariffs became even more crucial. Machines were transforming economies, and factories churned out goods on a scale never seen before. But that created a new dilemma: how to protect these young industries from being wiped out by stronger foreign competition. The solution was protective tariffs. By making foreign goods more expensive, governments gave their own industries breathing space to grow. It wasn't just about national pride, it was about survival. Britain's Navigation Acts in the 17th century are a famous example. They imposed heavy tariffs and restrictions on foreign goods coming into British ports, effectively pushing trade toward domestic shipping and production. And this brings us to a bigger contrast that still matters today. When countries raise tariffs and barriers to defend themselves, that's protectionism. When they lower those barriers and let goods flow freely, we call it free trade. If a country ends up selling more abroad than it buys, that's a trade surplus. If it buys more than it sells, that's a trade deficit. So from ancient city-states to industrial empires, tariffs have never just been about taxes. They've been levers of power, shaping economies, politics, and even the daily price of bread or fish. And even now, they remain powerful and sometimes controversial tools in the game of global economics. So far, we've seen that tariffs are as old as trade itself, but their story doesn't stop in Athens or Rome. In the age of exploration, European nations weren't just chasing spices or silk, they were chasing treasure. The belief was simple. The wealth of a nation was measured by how much gold and silver it piled up. And how do you keep your treasure chest full? One way was to export as much as possible and import as little as possible. This was the essence of mercantilism. High tariffs on imports became the weapon of choice. Take Britain's famous Navigation Acts. Foreign ships had to pay heavy duties, making British ships the cheaper option. Tariffs here weren't just taxes. They were shields to protect local merchants and swords to keep rivals out.
Nice.
As one mercantilist writer put it,
the ordinary means, therefore, to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, wherein we must ever observe this rule. To some more to strangers yearly, then we consume with us invaluable.
Then came the rebels, thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, looked at all this tariff raising and basically said,
don't confuse money with wealth. True wealth is the ability to produce and exchange freely.
He argued that when countries trade without barriers, both sides benefit. Ricardo went even further. In 1817, he gave us the famous theory of comparative advantage. Even if one country is better at producing everything, it still gains from trade by specializing in what it does best. He summed it up.
Under a system of perfectly free commerce, each country naturally devotes its capital and labor to such employments as are most beneficial to each.
In practice, this thinking led to Britain repealing its corn laws in 1846, removing tariffs on grain imports. It was a landmark moment, the world's first great turn toward free trade. But not everyone was convinced. In countries like the US and Germany, still industrial teenagers compared to Britain, leaders feared that free trade would crush their young factories. Here came Friedrich List, who argued that new industries needed protection until they could stand on their own feet. This became known as the infant industry argument. In his words,
the power of producing wealth is infinitely more important than wealth itself.
In other words, sometimes tariffs are less about today's prices and more about tomorrow's power, so America raised its tariffs high. The McKinley tariff of 1890, for instance, set import duties averaging almost 50%. Painful for consumers? Yes. But it also gave space for U.S. steel, textiles, and railroads to grow into global giants. Fast forward to the 20th century. The world crashes into the Great Depression. Countries panic and start raising tariffs to protect their own markets. The U.S. passed the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, raising tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. Other countries retaliated. Trade collapsed. Economists today largely agree this trade war made the Depression even worse. The lesson? Tariffs can be powerful tools, but if everyone uses them at once, the global economy can choke. As economist Charles Kindleberger later noted,
when every country turned to protect its national private interest, the world public interest went down the drain.
After World War II, nations wanted to avoid the mistakes of the 1930s. In 1947, 23 countries signed the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, pledging to gradually cut tariffs and promote freer trade. Over the decades, this grew into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995. Average global tariffs fell dramatically. For a while, free trade seemed unstoppable. This was the golden age of neoclassical economics, which preached that open markets maximize efficiency and welfare. But history has a way of circling back. In recent years, we've seen a new wave of protectionism. Starting in 2017 and ramping up through 2025, the U.S. imposed heavy tariffs on imports from countries like China, Canada, and Mexico. The goals? Protect American industries, reduce trade deficits, and boost national security. The administration argued, as Trump put it,
"It's going to be only America first. America first."
Supporters say these tariffs have helped domestic manufacturers who struggled to compete with cheaper foreign goods. By taxing imports, they say, local businesses get a fair chance to grow, create jobs, and revitalize industries, kind of like giving Catville's local fishers a break. Tariffs also generate government revenue, which some hoped could offset taxes elsewhere. For people skeptical of free trade agreements, tariffs are seen as a way to push countries to play by the rules and negotiate better deals. On the flip side, critics warn that tariffs make everyday goods more expensive for consumers and businesses. When imports cost more, companies face higher production expenses, which can lead to price hikes and supply chain disruptions. Retail CEOs even warned about shortages and inflation spikes thanks to these tariffs. Some economists criticized the administration's focus on trade deficits, saying it misunderstands how modern global trade works. So, what do you think? Do Trump-style tariffs protect workers, or do they hurt more than they help? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next story about economics that's shaping our world today. See you next time!